Hello, everyone. The reason for the unusual situation with the chairs is there's going to be some dancing, and it won't be me, although I've considered it. Now, today is Messiaen and the Quartet for the End of Time. It's part of a series called Inventing Modernism. Luckily, that's already been invented, so we just have to review it. And it will include, Messiaen, Stravinsky, and Debussy, and Janacek, and Prokofiev, and a lot of my favorite composers whose languages, personal languages, define the century and have also affected everybody who composes in almost any genre of music at all. So I hope you come to hear some of those. Now, I'm going to read a short quote from Messiaen, which is his inspiration for writing this piece in his words, which are actually not his words because it's from the Bible. And I'm not going to stick with the religion for more than a moment because you're not here for that and we're here for music. But you have to know what he said was the inspiration of the piece. And I saw another mighty angel coming down from heaven, wrapped in a cloud with a rainbow on his head. His face was like the sun and his legs like pillars of fire, setting his right foot on the sea and his left foot on the land, and standing on the sea and on the land, he raised his right hand toward heaven and swore by he who lives forever and ever, saying, "There will be no more time. But in the days when the seventh angel is to blow his trumpet, the mystery of God will be fulfilled." Now, when he says there will be no more time, I mean, we all know that feeling. But he's talking about eternity, and the inspiration for a lot of his music has to do with trying to capture eternity in a short space of time, as the Blake see the world in a grain of sand and infinity in an hour. And that's basically what he's after. And then he describes his own musical language this way. "My musical language is essentially ethereal, spiritual, Catholic." And he means actually the religion, not as an adjective. "The modes, realizing melodically and harmonically a sort of tonal ubiquity, bring the listener closer to infinity, to eternity in space. The special rhythms, independent of the meter, powerfully contribute to the effect of banishing the temporal." Now, aside from all these grand claims, which he even said he said himself in the music, if you think about what I'm trying to do, it's ridiculous. How can anybody do this? So he had a little bit of a sense of humor about that. But he did try. But what he's also getting at was a new way for him and for Western music of thinking about rhythm. It was not new in the East. And he could be thought of, Messiaen can be thought of as the first Western composer to make a serious study of the rhythm of other cultures and encapsulate it for himself, to give it to codify it and to use it in his own way, in his own vocabulary. So in a sense, he was the first global musician. Other people did things that were inspiring to him that were like that. I mean, Debussy, of course, too, Scriabin, too. But in this case, there is a detailed study of the music, of the rhythms of India, and also of Greek rhythms. And I thought what I would do is invite someone, Preeti over here, who is actually an Indian dancer, who knows all about Indian rhythm. And I don't think, I'm going out on a limb, but it's not too dangerous. I don't think there's been a lecture on Messiaen where the actual Indian rhythms have been performed visually and with his music. So I think this is going to be a first, except for those of us who saw it about 20 minutes ago. Now, in order to do this, you have to understand the big shift. It's a huge paradigm shift, which is Western music up until the late 19th century tended to be, and I should say classical, because if you're going medieval, that's not true. So forget the Middle Ages. We'll get back to that briefly. But from, let's say, the time of Bach until Debussy and Scriabin into eventually Messiaen, music tended to be in a meter, like 3/4, like a waltz or a march. It had a meter, and Western music was thought of as metered with time signatures, and the divisions were of large-scale meter rhythm would be divided into meters, which then would be subdivided. The opposite started to occur with Stravinsky, was a real innovator here, of thinking of small units, just 1, 2, 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3, 4, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 1, and just thinking of building a piece not from a meter, but from a tiny, smallest value and adding and subtracting those values. Stravinsky stumbled upon this in his own way, drawing from folk music of Russia, which didn't exactly do that, but it is true that Russian folk music, if you listen to some of the songs and you notate them properly, exactly, I mean, as they're written, you might have trouble with the meter because people didn't know about meter. Folk don't do that. You know, in other words, it's true. Bartok found the same thing. Ruth Crawford Seeger found the same thing when she listened to people singing in the field in America, that they don't know about key signatures and they don't know about time signatures, so they don't do it. So this was a big inspiration. But Messiaen didn't want to be an imitator of Stravinsky, although he got close. And he didn't want to be an imitator of Debussy. So taking what he could from them, he also stumbled upon, in the Paris Conservatory, an extensive encyclopedia of Indian rhythm. And we're going to get back to that in just a moment. And we'll spend quite some time with it. But before we do, I must take you quickly through the story that surrounds the piece, because everyone needs to know it, and you could look it up. So I won't spend too much. You probably have a device on you that you could Google it. So basically, Messiaen was drafted into the French army in 1939, along with lots of other Frenchmen. And he had terrible eyesight, so he was given the job of moving furniture first, and then he was transferred to be an orderly, a medical attendant, and he was stationed in Verdun, France. And it's interesting to me that he was stationed in Verdun, because that is where Ravel was stationed in World War I. And both of them had the same reaction to Verdun, which was its birds. Now with Messiaen, you can expect that if you know his music, he was obsessed with bird songs. But Ravel also, for some reason, thought of the sound of war as compared to the sound of birds in the morning, and he wrote about it. And he took a nightingale's call and put it in L'Enfant et les Sortilèges, his opera for children. And it sounds a little like Messiaen because it's the same bird. So we'll get back to those birds in a moment. Then the Germans, in 1940, the Germans suddenly came crashing into France, and he and some other musicians that he met had to run. Now, who were the musicians that he met? In Verdun, he met a clarinetist named Henri Acocca, and he also met Etienne Pasquier, who was a famous cellist at the time. Acocca had his clarinet with him because he was playing in a military orchestra, right there. But when the Germans came, they all ran, and Messiaen and Acocca and Etienne Pasquier ran together into the woods, being musician friends, and they got arrested there. They were transferred to an area outside of Nancy, and while they were there, Messiaen continued some sketches he was writing for clarinet, which he had started in Verdun, because Acocca had his clarinet. Even when he went running through the woods, he had his clarinet. This is a great thing. His story alone is amazing. He always had his clarinet. And Messiaen wrote a piece for him called The Abyss of the Birds. It had nothing to do with with the Quartet for the End of Time, which had not yet been thought of by Messiaen, but it was about the birds in the area, and also about silence, which is the abyss. In silence, there is a sense of nothingness, of course. And so from nothingness to birds and back. And here's a little bit of what he wrote and forced Henri Acocca to sight read in a field. that was not the entire movement, but that was a nice chunk of the middle. So then Akoka, and you played with didn't you play with his nephew? With Pasquier, the cellist nephew. Yeah. Well, you can ask him about that later. Anyway, Akoka and Etienne Pasquier and Messiaen were then, along with hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of, actually thousands of prisoners, brought to Stalag 8A, which was not a concentration camp. And I stress that because there are many record-covered things and liner notes and articles that say concentration camp. It's wrong. That's usually written by someone who didn't know the difference between a prisoner of war camp and a concentration camp, and it's all over the place. It was a prisoner of war camp in which they suffered a lack of food and freezing cold and other things. Messiaen was only there a year, but there was no one intended to be killed there, and most people were freed at one point or another, and the musicians were treated much better than everyone else. And Messiaen was recognized as a famous musician. He was 31 years old. He was quite well known. And the German guards gave him his own barracks, music paper, a pencil, and a guard so he could compose. Now, he was freezing and he was starving, and he suffered physically during that year. But he was protected, and they smuggled him extra food. And they smuggled the musicians extra food. And we know this partly because François Mitterrand was one of the prisoners who wrote about this too, that he hung out with the musicians so that he could get the food, even though he was a lawyer at the time. So not only that, once a week they had chamber music concerts and vaudeville and variety entertainment in this place. They had when Messiaen was there was a 6,000 book library, and they called it the Little University because the guards did not stop them from giving each other classes. So there were a lot of professors and a lot of experts in all sorts of things, and what they did to pass the time was organized classes, and they taught each other. They had English, French, and German lectures, and Messiaen gave several lectures there. While he was there, he, with Akoka and Etienne Pasquier, they met Eugène Jean Boulaire, a French violinist. They decided, Messiaen had already started sketching some music with violin, and he finished a movement of this. They decided to write something together. Eventually, Messiaen decided they needed a piano, and the guards got Messiaen a terrible piano, but they got him a piano. They took the cellist, Pasquier, into the local town of Görlitz and let him pick out a cello and bought it for him. Now, Messiaen says that the cello had only 3 strings, but it's not true. I'm sorry, Messiaen got carried away. They got him a decent cello. And Pasquier himself wrote a lot about that. He said why Messiaen kept saying it had 3 strings was beyond him. He said the story's bad enough. And then the clarinetist, of course, had his clarinet, and the violinist at first had to borrow a violin. There were 5 or 6 violins circulating, but then the commandant got him a decent violin. And eventually they gave the premiere in front of German guards and officers and people in stretchers and people who had been quarantined, and about 300 to 500 people, no one knows. Messiaen said 5,000, again, wrong. Okay, now, to the rhythm. Messiaen himself wrote a beautiful book about his musical language. It's highly technical, though. For any musician, it's a great book to read. If you don't read music and you're not steeped in some theory, it's not fun. So we're going to try to make it easy to understand a lot of this. He talks about his influence of Indian rhythm. You have some pages in front of you. It doesn't matter to me if you can read those pages. If you can, fine. If not, you won't suffer one bit. The first thing is an example Messiaen gives of a rhythm of Stravinsky, which goes 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 1, 2, 3, 4, 1, 2, 1, 2, 3, 4, bop, 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 bop. That's the thing on the top. It's from the Rite of Spring. Bop, 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 bop. And what he says there is that A, the 5/16, and B, the 4/16, is then made into a slight adjustment where the A is shorter. Instead of 5, it's 2. So instead of 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, it's 1, 2. But the B, bop, 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 stays the same. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 1, 2, 3, 4, 1, 2, 1, 2, 3, 4. So the A is shrunk, and the B is the same. That's something that Stravinsky did a lot, and Messiaen discovered that it was also a concept in Indian rhythm. So he was very happy whenever he found things that Stravinsky did in other cultures, because then he could be inspired by the other cultures and not steal from Stravinsky. Okay, so right underneath it, I might ask Preeti to say this for me, but I'm looking at Simhavikritita. Oh, I'm saying it terribly. Simhavikritita. Simhavikritita. Is that okay? Simhavikritita. Tikata tikata. Okay. What you see there are A's and B's, where the A gets bigger and bigger. The A augments and then smaller and smaller, but the B does not change. So A, I don't even have to perform this for you. You see the A is an eighth note. And if you don't read music, don't worry, because you're going to hear all this in a minute. The A is then, the letter A is a quarter note, then it has a dot, then the dot is removed, and then it's an eighth note again. So in fact, this is also a palindrome, because it gets bigger and bigger and gets smaller and smaller. Another concept in Indian music. So now let's get right into this. And I'm going to, this is our guest just for this one lecture. I wish that we could do this kind of thing more often, but this is Preeti. And would you like to, I think I have one more thing to do. And then you'll get to work. I'm going to show you the difference between a Messiaen kind of rhythm and the same rhythm if it were a waltz. Can you play the opening of the 7 trumpets? And then you can get right into it. Okay. That's enough for now. Now, if you're trying to do something in 2 or 4 or 3, it's not going to work. How would that sound, as a waltz rhythm? I'll play it for you. If you take out his rhythms, use the same notes, then it becomes regular. And I'll put in some harmonies that were typical French harmonies of that period. That's so you know how different this is. Okay, now could you play that again, and then Preeti's going to come up and we'll start to discuss what those rhythms are. They're all playing in unison, which might have saved rehearsal time in a place like that, although it makes it very hard. At the same time as it might have to do with Indian music rhythm, because he's trying to concentrate on just rhythm and pitch here. Excuse me. Preeti, let's see, what shall we do first? Yes.
Should we just demonstrate that?
Let's do the demonstration.
So shall I, since they've heard it, shall I just do it and then we can do it together?
Yes.
Is that
So shall I say what you're about to do? Yes. Preeti is a classical Indian dancer, and she's going to dance the first few bars of the Messiaen because those rhythms are typical Indian rhythms. So you'll see what they look like danced, and then we'll put it together, and we'll start to analyze the rhythm.
Yeah, I'm thinking without a paper, so we'll see how I do.
Okay. The last one was a little different. It was a tikata-tum. Yes. Okay. Now, can we do that? This is not normally danced to, but it so happens, I'll say a few things and then she'll correct me, that in Indian rhythm, just like Messiaen was trying to do, you build up in small units and subtract in small units. And you'll see there are palindromes, and there are other things that he was concerned with added rhythms and balanced and unbalanced. So the whole technique is Indian. And this music, in a moment, will seem like Indian music to you. Let's do it together. Now, I do believe this is the first time in history an Indian dancer has been reading Messiaen's rhythms. Yeah, it works very well. Now, Preeti, why don't you come over here for a moment and say, let's talk rhythms for a moment. I'll ask you a question, then you can go from there. In Indian rhythm, there's no notation. This is not the question yet. And instead, there is a system of syllables, and the syllables represent small units of time. And those units of time are put together, and much the way Messiaen works, and they become an entire vocabulary. And you want to give some examples of this?
Sure. I think I'll give you an example exactly of what you saw right here. I mean, Bruce said, I think you missed that part, and I said it again. And I spoke a different language with Bruce. I just demonstrated, it just goes, taka dimi, takita, taka dimi, taka tom. So it's those syllables that are the units of measurement that Bruce was talking about. And so you have ta, ka, di, mi, ta, ki, ta. And that would translate to 7 for us in Indian rhythm, which is ta, ka, di, mi, ta, ki, ta. So when you put them together, they go taka, di, mi, ta, ki, ta.
I should add there that 3 is always takita,
Yeah.
and 4 is always takadimi. Therefore. And then, so if you want 5,
Yeah. Therefore, if you want
need a
5, you need 2 plus 3. So it's taka, takita. So
Okay.
just to make it break it down to make it very simple. It's all a mix of 2s and 3s. So if you take a 2 and you add another 2, it becomes 4. And you take a 2 and a 3 and it becomes 5. And you take a 3 and a 4, it becomes 7. And that way it becomes very simple and much easier for Indian musicians and dancers, because we are considered the visual percussionists because of our feet, the footwork we do, much easier for us to remember since it's not notated. So we break it down in all these 2s and 3s as we do the combinations.
Now, I have to say that a lot of jazz musicians talk the same way, but they don't have any organized approach to the syllables. So I remember I was rehearsing, watching a rehearsal with the Orion Quartet and Wynton Marsalis right here a few years ago, and he asked them, they were playing a quartet of his, and he wanted it to sound rhythmically a little bit different, and their whole conversation was syllables, because he said it sounds like ta-ta-ta-ta-ta-ta-ta, and I went dee-ba-doo-boo-da-boo-da. And then they played it right. Because... And the thing is, you can have this kind of conversation if you go ta-ta-ta-ta-ta instead of da-bu-da-ba-ta. Everyone can hear what that is. This is thousands of years old, and it's completely organized down to an inch of itself.
But that's the only way Bruce and I could communicate.
Yeah,
because I can't read Western music. So
she's not reading Western music.
I'm not. I'm actually reading. I had to talk to Bruce, and then he had to write the takadimis here for me. And I said, no, but it doesn't sound like a 3. It sounds like a 2 and a, it doesn't sound like a 5. I said, no, it sounds like a 4 and a 1.
So do you want to dance this and say the syllables? Or
Yeah, sure.
Okay, you do it. You can also say the syllables if you want, but... yes, it's very related. I'll ask you. Yeah.
Just stop me in the middle if you'd like me to.
Comes from India.
If you have any questions. So I'm doing 4 and 3 right now, right at the beginning of this phrase. And so it goes. That's 7. So it goes. Now if I add, then I'll go taka, that's 2. Taka dimi, that's 4. And tom, that's 1. Right? So you go, so if I put them all together, just this first part that you see here, because I can't read the music, I just had to show it for you. So I'm going to go. So that's how I would translate that.
Now, why don't you speak it, dance it, and they'll play it?
Okay.
Or do you want me to speak it?
No,
Okay.
just this phrase. Right?
Yeah. There, okay. Now, let's go on further. One of the things that Messiaen talked about that he was influenced by in the rhythms of India is the added value. That's his own expression, but it means that if you have equal rhythm and then you suddenly add an unexpected rhythm, a tiny pulse to throw things off balance, you get a certain sound. And on your pages, you have an example of that. Let's make sure somebody didn't take my first page. Do you have a first page? Okay. Yeah, you see the added values? On the first line, you have ta, 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 and underneath it, rhythm with added value, ta, 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 ta. You see that extra thing? So it says ta, 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 becomes ta, 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 ta. And it makes you fall off balance. the second one, ta 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 ta, becomes ta 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 ta, and the next one goes ta 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 ta, with the added value that's just that dot. You see the little dot? Ta 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 ta. Messiaen uses this kind of thing all the time. Now, the beginning of this movement, Messiaen's, I'm going to play loudly where the added note values are. Because it's a da-da-da-bom. Now, Preeti, in Indian music, you have exactly the same thing, the sudden addition that shakes you off balance. Can you?
Shall we do the equal first?
Yeah, let's do
and
equal.
And then show them what the unbalanced is.
Yeah, and what Preeti's going to do is show simple equal movement, but when she does the unbalanced thing, bear in mind, this is not like a cat, like having a cat. Okay, the off-balance movement that she does when we do the off-balance is not a modern choreography she's thrown in, it's the real thing.
Yeah.
It's ancient art form. Okay, here we go, the equal version of it. Okay, and now I'll play some of it with the original balance. Unequal. Now, this is somewhat improvised. So can you just do an unequal one without music so I can see it too? Yes, now you see in Western music you don't get that kind of dance until the 20th century, rhythmically speaking, which is why when Stravinsky wrote The Rite of Spring, the dancers couldn't count it because they were used to counting in 4 and 3 in a lot of Tchaikovsky, which is hard to dance, but it's not hard to count. The Rite of Spring, they couldn't count. And they did learn to count it eventually, and they still use today, they don't use takadimi or any of that, they use 1, 2, 3, 4, which actually is fine, but it doesn't have any flavor. Okay. Also, it doesn't help you to see patterns to just use numbers, actually. So now, let's get to the palindrome concept. The palindrome concept, everyone knows, you can just walk all over the place. The idea that you have a palindrome in words, we all know what it is, this complete mirror image. Messiaen calls them non-retrogradable rhythms, which actually is not a very friendly sounding term. It means that you can't do the rhythm backwards because it's the same, therefore it's the same as forwards. I don't like it. He could have called it symmetrical or mirrored rhythm, that would have been simpler. Palindrome, he could have called it too. Non-retrogradable meant something to him, though, because he liked the non part. And I don't mean any joke about the bread from India. I mean, he liked... These bad things are always spontaneous. I would never work on something like that. Okay. Oh, I just thought of a really bad one. Okay, so later. So basically, the palindrome concept of not being able to go backwards also fits with the modes, which I'll tell you about in a moment, modes that cannot be transposed more than a few times. Because Messiaen called this the charm of impossibility, that you had limits. And he said it's only by working within very strong limits that you can begin to understand eternity. That's an easy concept to grasp if you get it, or when you get it. No, but in other words, the only way to bump up against eternity is to bump. You've got to have something in your way. It's the same old Zen thing about tennis with a net and boundaries. Playing tennis without a net, you have no sense of anything. So the boundaries are what define your ability to comprehend or achieve anything at all. So he liked all the boundaries. Now, palindromes. You talk, I point.
Okay. So in Indian music, first and foremost, the Indian music that I am talking about, the name of that music is called Carnatic music, C-A-R-N-A-T-I-C. And it's from South India, that's where I come from. And the dance I was demonstrating is called Bharatanatyam. It's a classical dance form from South India as well. It's very technical because it's very rhythm-oriented. And there are two particular, these diagrams you see over here. They are palindromes in our rhythms, but they also show you, they're quite visual because they take the shape of instruments. Because we can have different kinds of combinations. There are 6 major combinations, and 2 of them are like palindromes. One is a big drum that we use called the mridangam. I've split that up for you so you can actually try to say it.
Mridangam.
Mridangam. So the dung is like a base of a drum, so mridangam. And the other one is called damaru, which is a hand drum, and it has a little tassel and like a pellet at the end. If you shake it, it hits the side. So it's very sweet and small, so when you speak it, it's called damaru. So go da-da-da. And mridangam, mridangam. So you can imagine the volume as well. And so with that, you have the palindromes. The mridangam is big, so when it starts off small on either ends, and then it becomes quite voluminous in the center. So so the combination for that, the normal combination for students to study is 4, 5, 7, 7, 5, 4. And the other one is like 7, so it dips in. So it's 7, 5, 4, 4, 5, 7. Yeah, did I say it right?
Yeah.
Okay. So I'm going to try and, shall I just demonstrate with these symbols?
Yeah, but let me say one thing about the symbols that occurred to us. It's too obvious for you to recognize. When Preeti plays patterns on the symbols, she doesn't just click da-da-da-da for 4. The symbols are speaking the syllables. So the pattern of how you hit the symbol is an imitation of the syllable. That's why you might hear something more complicated than you would expect. So 7 is still going to be takadimi takita, or takita takadimi. So it's going to be right? Okay.
Yeah. Do it. So I'm going to try to get the mridangam for you. That's 4, 5, 7, 7, 5, 4. So this is how it will sound. These are small hand cymbals we use for dancing. The conductor of the orchestra will conduct this while the dancer dances. So this goes, for 4 you go taka dimmi. Then for 5 you go taka takita. Then for 7 you go takita taka dimmi. Now I'm in a palindrome, so I've got to go 7. So I'm going to go taka dimmi takita. 5 taka takita. 4 taka dimmi. So that follows that pattern. So it's going to sound like this. It's going to be taka dimmi taka takita takita taka dimmi taka dimmi takita taka takita taka dimmi. So that's one palindrome.
Yeah, now, I think one palindrome is good. And now, can we go to the palindrome? There are palindromes all over this piece. But let's go to a spot where I won't say they're easy to hear, because even when you were listening to that and you knew it was a palindrome, you don't listen in 2 directions. You listen in 1 direction. So hearing a palindrome is not easy. But the point of the palindrome in music is not necessarily for you to hear it. What? Because a lot of things in music are not for you. They are for the musicians and the composers and the artists. In other words, they make a sound that is very particular. It has philosophy behind it. It has meaning. It has structure. And you are getting it, but you may not be. The fact, whether you say, oh, that's a palindrome, that doesn't mean anything. The fact that you are hearing something grow and return, you might get that, especially in repeated listenings. Knowing it's a palindrome might be more interesting for you. But no one, and Messiaen too, is not writing the palindromes hoping that you will say, oh, a palindrome. That's just not, any more than Bach in a fugue is hoping that you will know all the techniques of fugue. That's not for a layperson to do. But take away the technique, and what do you have? Nothing. You have to have an approach and a language and a grammar to get that. Just like when you read a book, you are reading the content and the emotional qualities and the characters, and you are not thinking about grammar and saying, oh, what a good adjective. Well, you might say that. You might say, what a good adjective. And you might say, what a brilliant sentence structure. Let's put it this way. You might listen to a political speech. You're not likely to say that. Although you have a chance now. Okay, now. Let's hear some of the palindromes from the Messiaen. that was 7 palindromes. Let's take one and see, just like Preeti did, let's hear one. Let's take that, the 4th bar. Play it once. And here it is. Again, you don't have to read music, but you have taka. See, I can't help this.
Yeah.
You have taka and taka, and then you have takita taka, taka, tom, or this could be takita, but this is by itself. That's why I circled it. Taka, takita, and then taka. So it goes taka, 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 tam, taka, 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 taka. Okay, let's see if you can hear that. And as I said, it doesn't really matter if you can, but it's interesting. Go ahead. Okay? Fun, huh? Now, I mean, an aspect, technique for a composer needs to be intriguing and fun, or you stop writing. So, for most composers. Can you do our big palindrome with movement?
The dance?
Yes.
Okay.
I told you I wasn't actually going to dance. I might, though. Now that's a palindrome. So why don't you break it down into units? Now, one of the musicians, we had a little session together, and they asked all the best questions, of course. One of them was pointing out that, unlike the Messiaen music, each little rhythm is not backwards, but the units are backwards. So A becomes B, becomes C, and then C becomes B, becomes A. But within that, they stay in the same order. So that's slightly different, but it's still a palindrome as units. So let's break down that palindrome. That was, wait a minute, that's what I do. You're not supposed to go, oh, excuse me. But that's how my entire approach to lecturing. Okay, go.
So now you've been listening to rhythms, but there's another rhythm that happens with the upper body, which I'd like you to pay attention to the arms and what happens to the shoulders. And you'll find a palindrome there as well. The first one goes very good. Okay? Now watch the shoulder. See that, that's good. Very good. Now watch the shoulder. See that, that's good. Very good. Okay?
That's the middle, where taka, that's da is the middle of the palindrome. It's an easy one to spot.
Then you have now do the whole thing together and see if you catch all of it in 2 sets of palindromes.
All right. Now, another aspect of Messiaen's musical language that relates to Indian music sounds at first like an ordinary Western concept, but he uses it in an Indian way mixed with the Western way, and he forms his own language. It's a very simple thing, which is to augment a rhythm or to use diminution on a rhythm. Bach did it to take a theme and make it much grander and slower, or which is more interesting and more like what we're talking about with Indian music, to make it just a little bit bigger and a little bit smaller, and then a lot bigger, and then a lot, so that it's not metrically bigger and smaller, but by unit, by degree, fractionally larger, and then much larger. So let's hear in Messiaen first, starting, you know where that is. You'll hear the same 3 notes, which is an augmented chord. Is that supposed to be some kind of joke? Just thought of that now. It's an augmented chord, but he doesn't do it with a diminished chord. It's nothing to do with it. And he first plays it, then plays it just a tiny bit faster, then a bit slower, I should say, augmented, and then compressed, very short, and then expanded not only in time but in register. before we play that again, by the way, you don't need to look at your sheets right now. There's nothing there about this. Before you hear that again, let's hear a performance of some Indian music with everything. It's got a singer and drums and a hard-to-hear violin in this case and a drone, where we're going to listen for 1 minute and 40 seconds. At about 1:30 or so, you're going to hear something extremely similar to this in terms of rhythm, not pitch and mood, but rhythm, extremely similar, and other patterns along the way that might make you think of Messiaen.
Tam tim taranatam, dinatagina tam tim taranatam, dinatagina tam tim taranatam, dinatagina tam tim taranatam. Tam tim taranatam.
So there it is, the Digadai drum thing, if I'm saying that right, in which you heard short, expanded and contracted in a very similar way to Messiaen. Now, Preeti is going to say something to us about the underlying pattern because, in fact, that whole thing is in a pattern of 8, but above it are polyrhythms. Polyrhythms didn't really make their way into Western music until the 20th century, except for a few basic ones, like the hemiola, where you go, we might go da da di da 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 dum 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 dum. And you find it in Baroque music and in certain Spanish music, but polyrhythms of this nature were a 20th century phenomenon. This piece was written at the time of Vivaldi. It's kind of a strange thought. So here, tell us a little bit about that.
So just in a very simple format, what you heard right now is a piece for 5 or 8 minutes or something. So the entire rhythmic structure of the piece goes in cycles of 8. And if I may just ask you to just try with me, you just take your hands and then take
your own hands.
Take your own hands. Yeah, that's true. And then take one hand and just place it on as a clap. So that's counting as 1. Now take your little finger and just lift your hand and go 2. Press it down on that hand, yeah? So the little finger, yeah, little finger. And then take the ring finger, that's 3. Then the middle finger is 4. So you go to 1, 2, 3, 4 so far. Now you're going to slap it down again, that's 5. Open it completely like a circle, that's 6. And then you're going to close it again, 7. And then open it again as another circle, 8. So you got 4 claps and then what I would call 2 circles. As a clap and a turn is a circle. And that's what Bruce is writing over there.
1,
it's like
2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8.
Yeah? So if we try together, we go 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. We'll do it again. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. And that is the kind of easiest as one of the first rhythms we all learn, how to do 8. And so this entire piece is structured around 8 cycles of 8.
I'm going to butt in for 1 second. So now this is going to seem easy to do because you're just going 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. you have to keep doing that while you listen to this.
Yeah.
And what's happening is that the music is the increasing numbers from the 8 to more values, more subdivisions, but equally spaced in the same space of time. The increasing number of divisions is being fit in there, and therefore you have, or removed, and therefore you have the same effect as what they were doing in the Messiaen. Okay, let's try a little bit.
We'll try it, and we can all do this together. All clap.
Here we go. Now, do we have to wait for her to do something else?
Tam tim tarana
introduction.
tam dinatagina tam tim tarana tam dinatagina tam tim tarana tam dinatagina tam tim tarana tam tam tim tarana tam
Okay, that's all I wanted to see. But the good thing about that is it showed you were listening. Because you could have decided, like a bad musician, I'm just going to do my part and not listen. But because you listened, you got messed up. That's good. So then the idea is that if you trained in this, then those things are part of what you know what's coming and how to deal with it. Okay, now we need to, thank you, Preeti. We need to move on to some more aspects of Messiaen's rhythm, but this one is quite different. In the first movement, Liturgie de Cristal, there are two things going on. A rhythmic dialogue between the piano and itself, a rhythmic and pitch dialogue, plus a similar thing going on in the cello, and then bird songs. Now, you know Messiaen loved birds. He notated birds' songs quite accurately, and he used them in his music. So let's dispatch the birds quickly, but let's hear a little bird music first. How about both of you? Let's hear the birds and just the violin and the clarinet. Yeah, can you do it without the rest of them? Okay, those are the birds. Now you can start to ignore the birds later because they're just flying around. We need to concentrate on this other stuff. On the bottom of your first page, there's a non-retrogradable rhythm, the very last line. And here, maybe I'll do this. The cello plays very, very high, 5 notes over and over. But the rhythm of those 5 notes is a 15 value or 15 articulations long. And so what happens is the 5 notes have to be played 3 times to fit into the 15 values. And if you look, the 15 values are on the left where it says A and B, divided into 2 palindromes. A goes ba, 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 ba. That's the first palindrome. It's actually much slower than that. And then the second one, ba, 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 ba. Those are the 2 palindromes. So can we hear in the cello some of this? And again, do you hear it? You are hearing it, but do you need to recognize it? It's like a lot of things in music. It gets to you. And if we were discussing in film technique how certain splices were done and what they make you think, you can now be aware of how certain editing is done, but unless you are actually a film editor, you don't need to jump out of your seat and recognize the process. But it's fascinating. So here is some of that. Okay, now you're probably totally hypnotized by now, which is fine. Frankly, it's more hypnotic because there are intertwining patterns that repeat, because your mind receives that information, maybe not consciously. So it has a dizzying aspect. Now the piano is doing its own dizzying similar aspect, which is the piano has, 29 chords overlapping with a rhythm of 17 pulses. You find that humorous? Yeah, well, and it keeps happening over and over. These, by the way, generally speaking, I forgot to mention that Messiaen loves prime numbers. He also likes huge numbers. But these are both huge for music, I should say, not huge for math. He actually found some of this in Indian rhythm and some of it from Greek rhythm, where the prime numbers are an extremely important aspect of Greek music. So let's hear just the 29 chords equal value. The 29 very crystalline chords. They're quite beautiful and strange, and I'll talk about them later as where these harmonies come from. Now let's hear just the rhythm. Can we do that just playing one note, maybe? Okay. Now, that rhythm is not meant to do anything to you in particular except disorient you, which with the chords it will do. Now, what is going on here? There is a relationship, which I don't think we need to get into the whole thing, between melody in Indian music, raga, and the rhythm. And that relationship is very similar to this. However, this also exists in medieval European music, where you have a rhythmic pattern that you may not perceive at all. And overlapping it is a melodic pattern that is usually much shorter, which you may or may not perceive depending on what the composer had in mind. Again, the composer was not writing this, would not be there to entertain you. Music was spiritual, and there were theological, philosophical reasons for doing these things, just as there were for Messiaen. And at any given moment in the history of any music, there are spiritual, philosophical reasons for the techniques. They're not always there in certain periods of Western history, but certainly in the Middle Ages, these given rhythms and melodies that intersect in certain ways have symbolic value. For Messiaen, they were Catholic value too, and they had to do with eternity, etc. So let's hear a little bit of this music where you will hear two birds and two what he called rhythmic pedals. But in the medieval terminology, which Messiaen never used, it's called isorhythm. If you want to look it up, ISO, isorhythm, like isometric exercises that have things that are equally against each other. Isorhythm has, this is interesting, the melody is called cholera, like color, and the rhythm is called talia, which sounds a lot like the Indian tala, but it's a coincidence. Because talia means like to tally up, and tala means to clap, right? The rhythmic cycle, but the word. The rhythmic cycle, yeah. Okay, here is the beginning of this piece. that's a fragment of that. Thank you. And now, in the time we have, I'm going to try to get into the melody and harmonic aspects of this, which one reason for spending so much time on the rhythm, several reasons. One, Messiaen said that he himself was a rhythmicist and that it was rhythm that gives birth to melody and harmony. And in fact, his investigations of rhythm are actually they're more unique, if I can say it that way, than what any other composer was doing at that time in Western music, because Schoenberg, for example, was always concerned with harmony and melodic line and melodic structure and intervallic structure, but his rhythms were the rhythms of German music as they had always been. Stravinsky did a lot of rhythmic innovation, but others, Bartók too. Bartók took his modes, his scales, and his harmonies from folk music. He invented some. His rhythms were also from Hungarian folk music and from the music that was known, but this breaking down of a cultural barrier is extraordinary. And now it's common in music, very common, but then it was not. So let me go to the piano, Benji. You have on your pages, on page 2 in the middle, you have some modes. The harmonies and the melodies of the modes give him everything. I mean, they come from the modes. In other words, all the melodies and all the harmonies come from these modes. These are modes of limited transposition. What that means is he did not write melodies in major or minor. At that time, a lot of composers were freeing themselves, and had been for a while. Debussy before him, Scriabin before him, Rimsky-Korsakov before Messiaen. They had been freeing themselves of the tyranny, as Schoenberg put it, of major and minor. Messiaen, however, investigated modes that people used, like Debussy's favorite whole tone scale, and he noticed that it seemed important to him that you only could transpose it in 2 ways. Because once you do another one, we've already heard that in a different order. Because you've got 6 whole tones, whoops, that gives you all 12 notes on the keyboard. So if you do any other transposition of it, it's a repeat. So that's one is a mode of 2 transpositions, whole tones. He didn't use it a lot because he was afraid of sounding like Debussy. You know. That's not Debussy, that's just whole tones. Okay, now, another mode that he loved was the octatonic mode, which he learned, I guess he gleaned it partly from Stravinsky, who used it a lot. This one is mode 2. Why? Because you can transpose it 3 times. Here are the transpositions. After that, you're repeating yourself. It's also called the symmetrical mode because it's whole step, half step, whole step, half step, whole step, half step. This is a great mode. I'm going to say it again. This is a great mode. This mode is great because, unlike the whole tone mode, which is beautiful, this mode has built in, perhaps by accident, who knows, built into it a whole series of chord progressions that are beautiful, but they are not at all like major and minor progressions, but they use the same harmonies. So, for example, using this mode, you will get chords progressions like this. Or they're beautiful, and Debussy sometimes used this, Stravinsky used it, but you will never get this, never. Can't do that. It's not in the collection. So think of it mathematically. It's a collection of pitches which generates or yields a whole bunch of chord progressions. Those chord progressions are very usable, but they will not give you what you're used to. They'll give you something fresh. Stravinsky used it at the beginning of Symphony of Psalms. It's already octatonic. These 3 chords are not in any key together, but they are in the octatonic collection. This, from the Rite of Spring. Oh, sorry. These 2 chords, C major major and E flat 7 do not exist in a key together, but they do in the octatonic collection. Okay, get the idea? So that's a beautiful collection. In fact, let me tell you what Messiaen wrote about this collection. And then you'll see, he had, like Scriabin, he had synesthesia, and like Rimsky-Korsakov. And this is his description of that mode. In the first transposition, it is defined like this: blue-violet rocks speckled with little gray cubes, cobalt blue, deep Prussian blue, highlighted by a bit of violet purple, gold red, ruby, and stars of mauve, black, and white. Blue-violet is predominant! Exclamation point. Nobody has ever been able to look into this because so far only 3 famous composers had this issue. It's not enough. Okay, so let's take a moment to hear some octatonic music. This is from the Louange à l'éternité de Jésus. Doesn't it sound less religious in French? I don't know. Sounds different in Praise for the Eternity of Jesus. It's the same thing. Okay, and what we're going to have here is very beautifully written, in which the chords in the piano are just repeated chords that come right out of the octatonic scale. They're all major or minor chords, familiar chords, but they are organized in the octatonic system, so they don't sound like you're in a major key. And there's a beautiful cello line that keeps getting keeps getting redefined. The same line gets redefined. And I'll say one more thing. The rhythm may not be actually influenced by Indian rhythm, but it is related to it in a very weird way, which is there is no time signature, and there are just pulses. And there's a group of 10 pulses, and then a group of 7, and then a group of 4, and then a group of 8, and then again, 10, 7, 10, 4, 8. Not always, but he has these patterns that come back. They're so slow you would never notice that. Here we go. There's no good place to stop. The music you're hearing, even though it is a very famous movement that is often extracted and played on cello concerts, from this piece, actually was not written in the prisoner of war camp. He wrote it in 1937 for a celebration called Fête des Belles Eaux, a celebration of beautiful water. And it was not written for cello and piano. It was written for 6 ondes marteneau, which is an electronic instrument that was new at the time and is a very bizarre instrument, and it was played by 6 women in white gowns with fountains going. And then, of course, when he was in the prisoner of war camp, it became a meditation on Jesus. So you have to know, you got to wonder. I mean, there are people defending that, saying it's sort of the same thing. And I think it warrants discussion, that's all. Yeah. I'm not going to come to a conclusion, but if you deny that it is an interesting aspect. Okay, moving on. Another movement that was written before is the last movement, Louange à l'immortalité de Jésus. Another praise, louange is praise, a praise to the immortality of Jesus for violin and piano. It's very similar. This one is completely different, but similar in how slow and repeated piano notes and a soaring string instrument. This one is also played at lots of concerts for violin. And it was also not written, actually, at the prisoner of war camp. It was written in 1931. And it was really different in terms of the keyboard pulses. So let's hear how it goes for a moment, then we'll hear the organ, and then maybe we'll hear a little bit more. I know we're about to go over for a few minutes, but it'll just be a few moments. Stop you there. But I'm going to play, and you can listen and you can leave after a few moments of this if you want. But first I want to say there are many things on your sheets that I didn't discuss. If you know me, the lecture is actually 9 hours long. And so I decided at some point that instead of doing 9 hours and trying to fit into the time we have, to give you more material. If you're a musician, you want to look this up, I can tell you right now, you can go on the internet, and if you are a musician and read these things, you can find demonstrations that you can on YouTube. Messiaen is talking about it. It's not as good a lecturer, but he's but there's also a website, there's so much material. So I gave you a lot of stuff that you would not be able to find that could help you if you're the kind of musician to pursue this. Otherwise, don't worry about it. And we decided to emphasize the rhythm because this relationship you will not find anywhere. Well, I was very pleased about that. And now, this piece that you just heard a little bit of, in its original version for organ, in a different key, much slower, played by Olivier Messiaen in 1931. One comment while you're hearing this. Notice the piano played rhythms, and in the organ it's just sustained. You can't do that on a piano. So that was his solution. here's a man who, this is a composer who really is confronting eternity. This is not an entertainment. This is not a prelude. This is for him and his religion. And you can tell that's it. It's a far cry from the fast, excited music, but it's all the same composer, and it all relates, actually. The next lecture on Debussy, make a note that it's not till October 15th because of Rosh Hashanah. Speaking of religion, I know it will seem like an eternity. And I look forward to seeing you then. And please, let's thank our musicians and